Hey everyone, good evening. Thanks for joining us for another Wednesday night Bible study here with Nicholasville Church of Christ. Last week, really 2 weeks ago, we introduced this new series, Theological Themes of the Old Testament, by thinking of the Old Testament as this epic story, and it's the true story of the universe, and it's also our story as the people of God. That's what we thought about a couple weeks ago. And last week, we looked at what I called the lay of the land. We thought about the way the books of the Old Testament are arranged, where certain benchmark events fall on the chronological timeline, and also the geography of the land in which the Old Testament story takes place. And so this week, we're ready to move past that type of introductory material and begin to look at the substance of the Old Testament story itself. And I'm really excited about this. And most of the time in this course, we're going to be moving through the Old Testament story basically from start to finish. But before we do that, I'd like us to spend some time focusing on a couple of key themes that are central to the overall Old Testament story. And being familiar with these themes in advance before we start moving through it from start to finish, I think that will help us appreciate the big ideas of the Old Testament better. Maybe you've heard the saying before that the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Well, thinking about a couple of these themes ought to help us focus on the main thing as we read the Old Testament. And so there are two of these themes that I'd like us to focus on. The first one is the theme of redemption, and the second one is the theme of covenant. And tonight we're going to focus on the theme of redemption. So when you think of the word redemption in relation to the Bible and Christianity, what is it that normally comes to your mind? I would imagine for most of us, if we thought about it for a little while, we would probably say one of the first images that would come to our mind is the cross. The cross, of course, is a New Testament event, and it is the central event in the Bible, along with the resurrection. And it's through that event that we see everything else. We see everything else in Scripture, and we see everything else in relation to our daily walks with God through the cross and also the resurrection. But when the New Testament describes Jesus' death on the cross as an act of redemption, it's basically borrowing a word and a concept from the Old Testament. Redemption in the Bible is a word, it's a concept with roots in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament itself, the Old Testament concept of redemption, that was not something that the Old Testament writers just made up. It didn't come out of thin air. They didn't invent that term as an inherently spiritual or biblical term. It was a term that existed in their world. It was a term that they took from their culture and society and used it to describe how God interacts with human beings. And so I hope that that kind of chain makes sense. Redemption in the New Testament is an Old Testament word and concept, and the Old Testament got that word and concept from their surrounding culture. I think we can all quickly agree that the culture in the times of the Old Testament was quite a bit different from today's culture. I think we can all acknowledge that. And all we have to do is kind of just look at some things. We look at the way that they dressed or the way that they traveled and the dwelling places in which they lived, and we see clearly it was a very different time. But often our minds just kind of stop there. And we notice these very obvious, these very visible differences between today's culture and the Old Testament culture. But we don't always take time to appreciate some of the deeper, some of the under the surface differences between life in the times of the Old Testament. Of course, Old Testament covers a broad span of time, and depending on, what part of the Old Testament we're in, we could be thinking, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. But we don't always think about these under the surface differences between life in the times of the Old Testament and today. And those under the surface differences, they're harder to detect because they have to do with how people think and how people relate to one another and what they consider important. And those things are less obvious than something like, again, the clothes they wear or the types of dwelling places they have and things like that. But these cultural differences, and some of them are going to be very different and might make us squirm a little bit, but these differences are going to be important for better understanding the concept of redemption in the Old Testament. And redemption is something that's very important for us to think about. So the big difference in our culture and in the Old Testament and ancient Israelite culture was that ancient Israelite culture was tribal. And in a tribal culture, the family is truly the center of society. Now, we often still say that the family is the center of society, or maybe we'll say that at least it should be, perhaps ideally. but it was the center of society to a much greater degree in ancient Israel's culture. And so, like in our society today, it is nice if the family can provide for one another and also look out for the less fortunate around them. But the state also does a lot to create economic opportunities and to give aid to the marginalized. And there are also other institutions that do a lot for these types of things. Well, in Israel's tribal culture, those types of things fell almost entirely on the family. It was up to the family to provide for one another, provide for the marginalized. Sometimes it was up to the family to enforce laws, and when someone did something horrible or some type of terrible crime, um, the family may have to decide who lives and who dies, or who gets sold into slavery. This type of thing is a very different world from our world. And in ancient Israel, the head of the family was the patriarch, and the patriarch is the oldest primary male in the family. And so, providing for the family, keeping the family safe, discipline, all of that ultimately rested on his shoulders, on the patriarch's shoulders. And so, when a woman married in this culture, she would leave her patriarchal household and she would join her husband's household. And she was then considered fully under the protection of her husband's household, under that patriarchal household. And this system, the way that they organized themselves, this meant that if a woman, if both her father and her husband died, and she also had no male children, if that were to happen, then she was in a truly bad situation. And so in ancient ancient Israel's world, what matters for an individual is who the patriarch of his or her family is, and that is how an individual related to society. And all this is quite a bit different from today, of course. We are not primarily identified through who the oldest male in our extended family is, but this is the way ancient Israelites identify themselves because their society was arranged differently. So, based on our description so far, clearly the patriarch is someone who has quite a bit of power. And whoever was next in line to become the new family patriarch, and this was typically the firstborn male in a family, they also would receive a double portion of the father's inheritance. This person would receive special privileges as they were growing up that his other siblings would not receive. And I realize when we just hear that, getting all this special treatment growing up and things, that might sound frustrating and it might sound very unfair to us, and that's certainly understandable. But I think it's important to remember that all of this happened because the next patriarch had to be groomed from a young age to be ready to assume the responsibility for an entire family when they became old enough, when they became the next patriarch. And so when that person would become patriarch, everyone else in the family would ultimately look to him as the source of their livelihood, and they would do this in a world without the social safety nets that we benefit from today. And so if we think about it for a moment, that is a tremendous responsibility. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And the last thing to note is that the physical dwelling place also was centered around the patriarch. So if we can picture this in our minds, all of the extended family members, they would live in their own housing units, and all those housing units would open up onto a shared courtyard. And this entire system, these housing units and the shared courtyard, it was all literally called, if we were to translate it from the Hebrew, it was literally called the father's household. That's what they would refer to this as. And there would also be burial places nearby to the father's household. And so when deceased relatives were buried there, that would solidify that family's claim to that piece of land as their own. And so that becomes significant, like in Genesis, when Abraham purchased land in Canaan to bury Sarah, that's a claim on that land as their own. So clearly, all of this that we've been describing, this tribal, patriarchal culture, this is all way different from how our society works today. The oldest male in a family doesn't necessarily have any power over the other family today, and he's definitely not expected to ultimately provide for all of them. And in our world today, family members are free to take jobs wherever they want, and they can move halfway around the world if they want. And there are also social safety nets in place in our society that do not require them to be so dependent on their family. And so overall, I think we're all probably pretty glad that we don't live in a tribal culture today and that our society is not structured this way. I think we have good reason to be glad for that. But I do want to note a couple of things in the Old Testament where we learn about God in relation to this structure. And believe me, I know we've been talking a lot about culture and things, but this is all going to come back around to help us better appreciate redemption by the time we conclude tonight. So a couple things about God I want us to notice. First, I mentioned earlier that women who married left their family household, their father's household, to join another. And this was done because genealogies and ancestral descent that was traced through the male line. And so women typically identified to the world at large by being so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's husband, so-and-so's son. This is how they related to the world. And so when the Bible mentions women in its genealogies, that is a big clue that something very significant is going on. And just jumping over to the New Testament real quick, in Matthew chapter 1, we read four women in the genealogy of Jesus. We read of Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And of these four women, one, Mary, she's a young girl, very young girl from the forgettable town of Nazareth. Nazareth was not a noteworthy place at all. One, Rahab, was a prostitute. One was involved in David's adulterous sins, Bathsheba. And the other one, Ruth, she is not even an Israelite. She is a Moabite. And yet this is the lineage of Israel's Messiah and the Messiah of the world. This is the lineage that we're being given. That should give us a clue that the Messiah and the God who sent the Messiah, they are going to operate under a different set of values than their surrounding culture. I think that's important to note. Second, I mentioned that a woman living without a father or a husband or a child was in a truly desperate economic and social situation. And we'll see that a little bit more here in a minute. And it's because of that that we read God in the Old Testament frequently calling on Israel to care for the widow and the orphan. This is him saying that they need to care for the most vulnerable under their tribal culture, those who were most likely to find themselves in these desperate situations. And so God has no desire to see them abandoned and destitute. Third thing I think that we learn about God, I mentioned that the firstborn male is normally the one who becomes the next patriarch. This is a society where the firstborn male had, again, great privileges growing up and then the greatest responsibility when they became patriarchs. And so we should take note when things happen like the younger son Jacob being chosen over the older Esau. Or we should be equally alarmed when Jacob intentionally blesses Joseph's younger son, Ephraim, over Manasseh at the end of the book of Genesis. Or when David is selected to be Israel's king, even though he has older brothers. All of this should tell us that God is interested in reversing or subverting social norms and kind of pulling forward the underdog, so to speak. And so God in the Old Testament, he is not interested in only blessing those who are lined up to receive blessing, only those who perhaps are privileged in that way. He is interested in blessing everyone. I think those are some things we learn about God within this ancient Israelite culture. So, how does all of this help us better understand redemption? Again, I realize it might seem like we have swerved from that central concern and got off into a lot of cultural stuff. Redemption is a term and it's a concept that again is part of this tribal, patriarchal culture. And so I want us to look at a couple of examples where we see redemption work within this culture and we see it happen on the pages of the New Testament. One is the story of Ruth. We sometimes think of the book of Ruth as the story of Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and then also her romance with Boaz. Well, the first part of that is definitely true. Her loyalty to Naomi is clear. The second part, though, is, I think, stretching things a little bit. Ruth and Naomi, at the beginning of the book, are clearly portrayed as women in crisis. They are facing the kind of desperate situation that we mentioned earlier. And in the book of Ruth, Boaz is so impressed by Ruth that he agrees to act as her redeemer. And by that he means he will bring her and he will bring Naomi into his household to economically and socially protect her. But Boaz mentions that there is a closer relative to them who would fulfill this social function first. And so Boaz must first see if that closer relative will act as the redeemer instead. And if not, then he will act as the redeemer. And that's, of course, exactly what happens as the book of Ruth goes on. And so this is redemption in ancient Israelite culture. A second example is Abraham, and he's just Abram at the time, and Lot in Genesis 14. So Abram and Lot, his nephew, have parted ways and are each the head of their own father's household. But then Lot, we read, he gets caught up in a military conflict in the region where he lives, out by Sodom. And Abraham, or Abram, being the older male, he has social responsibilities to Lot. And so Abram is a good patriarch here because he gathers the men under him and he risks the fate of his own household to go save his nephew's household. This is what redemption looks like in ancient Near Eastern culture. Third example is a powerful one. This is the example from the prophet Hosea, where God uses the prophet Hosea to make a powerful illustration to Israel, where he is told to marry a prostitute, and the prostitute is named Gomer. And the prostitute, when she cheats on him, what is it in the book of Hosea that he is supposed to do? Hosea is supposed to bring her back. Now, I strongly doubt that Gomer just woke up one day and decided to become a prostitute. Perhaps that's what happened, but in this tribal culture that we have been describing, it probably is more likely that she was forced into prostitution because her own father's household fell apart and she was left without options. And so Hosea marrying her in the first place is likely an act of redemption from her terrible circumstances. But then when she goes back to her old sinful ways, Hosea redeems her again and brings her back. And this is the illustration that God wants Israel to see, to understand how he relates to them and how he feels about them. That is, I think, a really powerful way of showing us the character and nature of God. And so with all this in mind, I'd like us to look at a couple of verses in Exodus that are actually the opening statement of the Ten Commandments. This is Exodus 20, 1 and 2. It says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And then if we were to keep reading, we would get right into the Ten Commandments. So the word redemption is not explicitly there in these verses, but I think you can see how the concept is there. Israel had been in a terribly oppressive situation in Egypt, and God has brought them out. God has redeemed them. And so to sum up what we've talked about tonight, redemption is a term that was used in Israel's tribal culture to refer to bringing someone out of terrible economic and social circumstances and restore them. And this is the theme that runs throughout the Old Testament. It is the story of God redeeming his people, just like a patriarch would be expected to redeem a wayward or a struggling family member. And we'll see as this course goes along that really the whole Bible, Old Testament and New Testament included, the whole Bible is the story of God redeeming the world, culminating in Jesus Christ. So I hope that that has made sense tonight. I hope that that has been helpful. Next week, we will look at the importance of covenants in the Old Testament, and we'll see how they relate to this theme of redemption, how they help us organize the Old Testament, and also what covenants tell us about the character of our God. But that is redemption, and this is going to be big for future classes, so I hope that this was helpful. Again, hope you all are doing well, and hope you all have a good rest of the week. Thank you.